Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of April 19th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined again by Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director for the same Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
This is the week of April 19th, that we're actually recording on April 20th, commonly called 420.
Earth Day?
I'm just leaving it there. I'm just leaving that there. No, I'll just say something about it. It's my older brother's birthday.
Yeah.
Who I will just say is an unlikely person to have 420 as a birthday. It's also Evan Smith's birthday.
Oh, I remember that now. That's right.
Remember that guy, Evan Smith?
What is he doing these days?
I don't know. Okay. Staying at home a lot, I think.
Probably.
He's actually going out for his birthday, I hear.
Oh, really? Okay.
Undisclosed location. An undisclosed sterilized location.
In a bubble somewhere?
In a bubble somewhere. Happy birthday, Evan, even though the chances of you hearing this are, let me think, 0.
Well, I know
I'm not sure who's less likely to listen to this, my stepbrother or Evan Smith.
Well, I don't know. You have to assume Evan Smith has a Google search for his name or something, right? So if we put it in the description, he might listen to it.
Now you're going. Now you're talking. We'll put it on Evan Smith's birthday, in a podcast celebrating Evan Smith's birthday. Jim and Josh discuss what we're going to discuss, which are the guns and police. So let's just get right to it. Enough tomfoolery. That's 2 minutes of tomfoolery. Not that I'm watching the clock. So, in this young week, much of the news that we're seeing, at least in Texas politics, or at least one of the big stories amidst a lot going on, I guess it's fair to say, is the response to the House passed bill last week that will, essentially allow unlicensed carry of handguns. So, this has gone by a number of different shorthand. I don't know if somebody message tested or whatever. They've kind of stopped calling it constitutional carry, I think, universally. But ultimately, we're talking about House Bill 1927, which, has some ins and outs to it, which, we can talk about if necessary. But basically is the unlicensed carry bill that the hardcore of Second Amendment rights / gun rights activists have been pushing for a long time, and until very recently was seen, frankly, I think, as kind of a stretch. And yet there it was, moving, with some speed through the House and passed on the floor after a lengthy but really never in doubt debate last Friday, as we're recording here on the following Tuesday. Then more news, as Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, fairly quickly said that he didn't think the votes were there to pass it in the Senate. He's elaborated on that, saying that if the votes were there, he'd bring it to the floor and would be more than happy to send it to the governor. But made a lot of news, by sort of following up on what some reporters had reported was skepticism based on his kind of gray area track record on expanding gun rights. There was I think Jeremy Wallace was kind of the first one that was all over this in print or in digital print on Friday with a piece in the Houston Chronicle. Patrick Svitek followed up, I guess, Sunday or Monday with a quote from Patrick, sort of enunciating, the position I just described, I think, and I think I described it fairly. How real do you consider this gray area that people attribute to Patrick? and I'm not questioning the reporting on this, but talk a little bit about why people think that, and I'm wondering how seriously you take that.
Well, I guess partially. I mean, let me just ask you first: what do you mean by gray area, in the sense of this idea that he's not sure about whether he has the votes to pass it? That gray area?
No, let's table that gray area just until the next. Actually, I don't even want to say table it, because that means we're not going to talk about it. Let's just wait on that. I'm blanking.
We're gonna recess. We're gonna recess on that until later.
We're gonna recess until April 20th
in about 10 minutes
at 1:50, because I know the rules.
So which gray area are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about the fact that Lieutenant Governor, Patrick had been sworn in as Lieutenant Governor less than a week, I think, when he got in trouble with the gun rights folks for saying he didn't think the votes were there for open carry in 2015.
Right. Basically saying more or less the same thing about open carry.
He said the same thing again a couple years later, once again earning, some degree of, at least carping, if not material pushback from, the gun wing, we'll loosely call the gun wing of his party, and we'll qualify that a lot in a minute. And then after the El Paso shooting, he, got a lot of media coverage for saying that he thought that, closing some of the loopholes on background checks was a reasonable approach, and that, he wouldn't be opposed to that. Now, none of that has happened. I mean, or certainly that
we're actually heading we're going the opposite direction.
So that thing certainly didn't happen. And the Lieutenant Governor had some, milder, fodder for the that's a little unfair, but not really, for the Second Amendment crowd on his 31 flavors priorities for this session that had to do with I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Senate was the one that had the allowing guns in hotel rooms bill that has moved through the Senate. But there has always been, but the spin right now is, because of ties with the very, with powerful and influential police groups, and perhaps the politics of policing, that the Lieutenant Governor has been, this is a phrase you'll almost never use, has been slightly to the left of where Second Amendment rights advocates are.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair.
So that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's sort of an interesting thing in all this in terms of, think about it. And I ask because, I mean, there's a lot of sort of gray areas in this, I suppose, right? I mean, on the one hand, to the extent that Patrick got blowback in 2015 for questioning, the appetite for open carry, in the Senate, I think, looking back on that, some of the surprise in that was because in some ways of how seemingly off-brand it was for Patrick, right? Who had kind of entered the office basically looking to really place himself as the most conservative, maybe elected official in Texas, maybe in Texas history. I don't know,
had dealt well. Texas history is tough because of those segregationist Democrats, but
modern Texas history, let's say,
and had already established himself as a senator, as the kind of right wing ballast in the Senate at the time that he was a member, and David Dewhurst was lieutenant governor, and it ultimately beat Dewhurst. A lot of reasons I shouldn't say beat Dewhurst right now, I guess.
That's not appropriate.
Defeated Dewhurst
in a fair election.
In a fair election in which he campaigned as, broadly speaking, the real conservative in the race.
Right. And the thing was, there was really little, attempt in that primary to moderate at all. I mean, there was sort of a jumping all over each other to see how, who could position themselves as the most conservative in a pretty strong field, as I recall. But then, so I think, that reticence on his part, towards advancing this is sort of strange. I mean, the other thing I think is sort of strange is this idea that, that Dan Patrick, who seems to have, the Senate under pretty extreme tight control, would basically say, well, I'm not really sure if the votes are there. Now, I don't think there's anything. Well,
I mean, I think he said the votes aren't there, to be fair to him. I think, yeah. So.
Yeah, I think in the previous time he said he wasn't sure. I mean, at this point he's saying they're not there. But I mean, even that's kind of curious to the extent that,
I mean, I was going to get to that at the end, but I think that's right. I mean, the myth, the myth of Dan Pat, or, and the myths are based in fact. The myth of Dan Patrick is that he's got the Senate under his thumb. So, I think what people are thinking is, well, if he wanted the votes to be there, they'd be there.
Well, and that's certainly what like Alan West is thinking, right? I mean,
Yes.
but I mean, no, but this is the tension that he's facing, right? Is that, this is, part of my understanding, this is part of the plank of the Republican Party. You've got Alan West out there saying, hey, this should move because you guys all said you were for this, at one point or another.
And I think they had one of those, things we both, I think, hate, those election items on the poll,
Oh yeah.
there's survey items on the Republican primary ballot where you vote for these propositions. And I think I think this was one of those propositions.
I'm sure 98% of people were for it, like they are for everything that's put on those ballots,
Right.
It's
not really an information gathering exercise per se.
But it does, before we get into kind of the politics of the groups that, that he's dealing with, I mean, I do wonder to what extent, this isn't just the nature of someone developing in the, let's say evolving into position because, he's in an executive office and we keep having mass shootings in Texas and elsewhere. And ultimately, at some point, when it comes time to decide, hey, who's responsible for fixing all of this, I think there's a lot of Republicans who are going to be called to account for this. And I think
you're lending credence to the Dan Patrick of October 2019 or October 2019, when, he seemed like, he issued his somber, thought that the background checks maybe might be a good idea.
Well, and it's one of those things too, where I think one of the difficulties in all of this whole space, the whole gun control space, and we'll talk about Republican attitudes towards guns in a second. But I think, the huge distrust of basically the other party in the electorate is so palpable right now that it's one of those real difficult things where I think, Republican elected officials will always say after a mass shooting, this isn't about guns, this is about people. We know from our polling that Republicans agree with this. We ask them what are the causes of mass shootings, and they say, mental illness is the main cause. Democrats say gun control laws, but at the same time, when, something like red flag laws come along that would specifically address removing guns from people who are, most likely mentally ill and will hurt themselves or someone else, it seems that Republicans in Texas are only willing to kind of dip their toe in the water and see whether this is okay. And then they seem to have decided that it's not.
Right. I mean, as we've said a bunch of times, and this way we don't have to delay, we have to deluge people with numbers this time. And we did a blog post earlier this week that'll be on the Texas Politics website, project website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu, in which we went through a bunch of these numbers and kind of looked at these Republican attitudes. But, to put it quickly, in the last time we asked people whether they wanted gun control laws made more strict, less strict, or left alone, the modal position among Republicans, 43% said they wanted the gun control laws left as is. And I think you pointed this out a lot, that seems reasonable and plausible given where Texas gun control laws are, which is they're already very permissive. And there's already been a lot of publicity around the passage of open carry and the weakening of the licensing laws to date. And
that's one of those things, I think, if you think about, one of the frustrating things about studying public opinion is how static it is most of the time. There's sort of an assumption amongst people who don't study public opinion that, every event that happens is going to shift the electorate like 50 points.
Yeah.
And that
almost never happens.
Which almost never happens. But I would say one of the things that was noticeable and palpable in, the last 10 years of polling that we've done is that there was a lot more appetite for Republicans for loosening gun control laws in the lead up to open carry than after it. And I think that's important. I think that was our colleague at UT, Chris Legend, calls this, the thermostatic model, right? The electorate wants something, the policy process adjusts, and then they say, oh, that's good. Okay, that's the right temperature. And I think the open carry debate
don't turn it down anymore.
Well, that's the thing. I think the open carry debate really exposed about where the right temperature was for Texas, which was basically to say, when we did polling, first of all, on that in particular, most people like the status quo, basically, permitted concealed carry. You can carry your gun around as long as you have a permit and you keep it concealed. There was more Republican support for permitted open carry. The interesting thing was, and this was in 2015, there was almost no support to be had for permitless carry, open or closed. 10% of Texans, 12% of Republicans wanted this. Most people wanted the status quo or open carry. But then after that session and that passage, we saw that, Republican desire for, again, loosening gun controls really evaporate in Texas. Now, the thing is that may be the case. And we've been talking about this a lot recently, and I keep using the same sort of analogy for it. But it's really hard for Republican elected officials to go back home to their Republican primary electorate and say, I went to Austin, I fought the good fight, and I made sure they didn't pass any laws that would make gun control laws stricter.
Right.
Not good enough. Because you know what? There's somebody lining up in the Republican primary who says, well, I'll take it further.
Right.
And I kind of feel like, maybe, in a global sense, that's where we find ourselves with this at this point. We've already, I would say the conservative legislature, and especially I think, with Dan Patrick in charge of the Senate, has already passed a number of conservative bills over the last 5 or 6 or 8 years that have really expanded, gun rights, have really taken on, let's say abortion access, for example, and some of these other hot button issues. And the question then becomes, well, what else do you do? And we're kind of at the point now where the what else you do is, well, do you just give everyone a gun? Is that where we are now when we're talking about gun control laws?
Right. I mean, and I think that, the issue here, and this is kind of, I think what we were getting at in this post we did Monday, is that, there's just enough of a mass of voters that still want to keep going on this within the Republican Party. And they're very committed. They tend to be strongly, strong conservatives. It's not even the most, all of the extreme conservatives. Mm-hmm. But you have the sense that the 24% of Republicans who wanted gun laws to be still less strict in October 2019 are people that pay a lot of attention to this and get engaged and vote in Republican primaries.
Yeah, it's definitely an important issue, right, for a small group of people.
Right, exactly. So I think there's some, it'll be interesting to see the next time we poll on this, which will be soon. Mm-hmm. How much this has moved and whether whether the thermostat has moved or not. Let's put it that way. The setting has moved.
Yeah, and I think that one major change I think is the shift of the White House from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Ultimately it makes the threats of a Greg Abbott or Dan Patrick to watch out for Joe Biden or Beto O'Rourke or whomever coming to confiscate your guns seem that much more real because you're not talking about the minority party. Yeah,
and a more political. You kind of alluded to this a minute ago, and I think it's important. That these notes, the last time we sort of asked about, the results you were talking about on unlicensed carry was only 12% supported. That was 2015. A lot of negative partisanship is flowed under the bridge. And, I don't know that we could go back. We probably could go back and maybe look if we have data on this, but it does seem to me that I would not be surprised if any measure we could come up with of negative partisanship has increased since then. It's hard for me to imagine it hasn't after 4 years of Trump in the White House, frankly.
Well, that's right. And it goes back to the whole, so what do we think may have, do we think that the 10% number has shifted dramatically, in the last 6, years? And I think, there's some evidence to say, yeah, maybe Republicans are more open to it because there's a Democrat in the White House. At the same time, the number and the attention to mass shootings in the state and the country has been pretty relentless, including here in Texas. Right. And so you could also argue, maybe there's even less support for some of these policies. We just, we don't know.
It's going to be interesting. It'll be one of the first things I look at next time we poll and get data back. Okay. So then if you think about the way this has been posed, it's basically, all these police attitudes we're talking about, or all these gun attitudes we're talking about, and then attitudes toward the police.
Right.
Now, the attitudes toward the police are, for the most part, among Republicans, less complicated.
Right. And the reason we're bringing this up here is because Patrick explicitly stated that, police groups, as in the past, are not really for this, and not that you guys who are listening to this need to know this, but the basics are, police don't want to show up to a shooting and have everybody there with a gun. Yeah.
Well, and I think there's two real proximate things to point out here. One is that the day before the day of this bill, there was an event on the steps of the Capitol with a bunch of, police chiefs from major cities and some small ones saying, hey, we don't want this. opposing it. And, within the, the universe of the Capitol and legislative politics and Republican electoral politics, the Republican interest groups are relevant.
Yeah, and the thing is, and I mean, more relevant maybe now than at any point in time. I mean, the police have always been sort of a core. I don't even know if I want to call the police a core constituency, but certainly police unions and police representatives have been usually an asset and an ally of Republican elected officials for the most part.
Yeah, and they're this is if you look at somebody like Cleet, this is a classic, well mobilized, well funded interest group that is also available for things like block walking and we think of the trade groups this way, but you think about the police this way too. I mean, police, there's police in every district.
Yeah, well, and the other piece of it too is when you have hearings on these bills, and let's say some nominally Democratic aligned group comes and testifies and says, hey, this is going to lead to more mass shootings, more of this, more of that. It's very easy for the Republican majority to say, well, these are people who already have an axe to grind. We know where they are. It doesn't matter. It's a lot harder to dismiss, the head of Cleet or a police chief from your district coming in and saying, this is going to make our job harder.
Yeah. And I mean, the presence of the police departments and I should put it this way, the presence of law enforcement as an institution has definitely become more politicized and deepened in recent years. The Back the Blue movement, the Blue Flags. It's a much more politically salient and politically mobilized force, both, in the public sphere, not only in, the political, the internal political world, but in the public sphere. It's become much more symbolic and made more so by, formal police organizations push back on the increased tempo of the conversation about reforming police practices in the wake of, the ongoing series of police shootings in recent years.
Right. And so, you take that complexity and you sort of try to stuff it all into a bag and simplify it. And that's kind of what you got out of the 2020 election, which is that the cities are on fire and that we need to protect police officers to be able to go out and do their jobs and, keep generally, Democratic cities from decreasing, these funds. A lot of Republicans felt like this was a really, their winning message in a campaign otherwise made very messy by the president. And it's not surprising they do. In 2021, February, 85% of Republicans expressed a favorable view of the police, 58% strongly. That's pretty much as high a level of favorability as we could see expressed of anything or anybody. I mean, Donald Trump at his peak may have been around, somewhere between 85 and 89%. I'm not sure he was at 58%, very favorable. But I mean, this is not, there's no daylight here between, among Republicans.
And we've got a long series of, we've talked about the proximate kind of factors accentuating this. Race is obviously a huge part of this, where we've talked about this in the, the kind of, what has been presented in many ways has been viewed as a kind of binary choice, which I think is a false choice, obviously, between the police and, Black activism and civil rights activism. But it's increasingly been seen as a binary choice by a lot of Republicans and by a lot of partisans, right? And partisan elected officials and thought leaders have furthered this to their, discredit, I think.
Yeah, but for the hate mail, it'd be interesting to kind of write about it and explore, the value or whether it's good tactics for police to be so politically positioned right now, whether on their own or as a tool of someone else.
Well, particularly given, what we know, from, having pulled on this, years ago, and really in the early, I have to go back and look, it was probably in the early stages of activism, or, the latest round of activism around police shootings. But, there's, an enormous wellspring of conservative support for law enforcement as an institution, probably as I recall, second only to the military.
Only to the military. Yeah, no, and that's right.
And that's of the same piece, frankly.
Right, exactly. The military and the police are sort of the groups that are above the others, and then you start asking about, federal government, state government, local
Right.
government, the public schools,
Right.
and they all fall far
And
below.
not in a completely polarized way. Now that's shifted in the last couple of years to some degree.
Hmm.
If you go back to those earliest, that earliest institutional polling, trusted institutions that we did, it's not like all the Democrats hated the military and the
No,
the police. It was just more evenly divided and just not as much of a consensus point as it was among Republicans, which I would say is, a function of conservative ideology and these kinds of constructs.
I think, just sort of listening to us talk about this, it does sort of point out sort of what Dan Patrick is navigating here, right? Which is that you've got a small but energized minority of Republicans for whom the gun issue is a voting issue, right?
Right.
Ultimately, that is something that might influence their primary vote, come whenever primary season turns out to be, right? Yeah. On the other side, you've got, basically police saying, yeah, I don't know if we want everybody to have guns. And by the way, I thought you were on our side. And, looking at Republican voters, the answer to that is they are on their side. 85% hold a favorable view, asked about, the shooting of unarmed Black civilians by police officers. And 78% of Republicans say those are isolated incidents, right?
Yeah.
And something else we kind of talked about, 89% of Republicans feel safe in the neighborhoods where they live in Texas, right? Far more than any other group in the country. And maybe that's, maybe from their view, that's due to the police officers and the police presence, right? As opposed to, get more complicated views of this. But ultimately, it's an interesting thing that we don't actually see very much, I don't think, in politics, where you've got, that minority within your party pushing for this thing, but you've also got, a big constituency of the other party with a lot of support from the majority of your party saying, hey, I don't think you should do that.
Yeah, there's an interesting intersection because of the policy overlap or where the policy meets here. So I think, what's interesting to me is I think that, that's what's made good copy in the last few days, right?
Right.
But it's also what, depending on, circling back to where, the rest of Dan, the gray area for Dan Patrick, and to a certain extent for Greg Abbott and for the Republicans overall is, that also creates some room to maneuver. Mm-hmm. So this goes back to the question of that we were entertaining a few minutes ago. Does, how deep is the opposition? How deep and how broad is the opposition in the Senate? Is it so deep, and is that why Patrick says he doesn't have the votes, or is it because he's some combination of that reticence, partially as a result of maybe these interest group politics, perhaps on principle, and how much is there a sense that there's some maneuvering going on here, because it seems to me. There's some hazard for Patrick here because he has to reconcile some competing interests here and some competing principles. On the other hand, it may just be we're not very used to seeing him have to do that. To your point that we don't see these flows in public opinion a lot. And this is part of and in some ways it leads back to the same problem. But I think there's this sense of, well, if the lieutenant governor's not having his way, wow, this must be some huge damn thing, right? Now, it's a significant thing, but I think there's also an opportunity for Patrick to come out of this looking pretty good. If he, can engineer some kind of a compromise on here, on this. And, on one hand, we could say right out that if he compromises on this, but they still get a bill out, that maybe has some kind of hedging, maybe a little bit more enforcement, maybe a little bit more protections for, latitude for police in situations where people have guns. He'll take some heat from this, quarter of voters of Republican voters for whom this is a, give me liberty or give me death issue. On the other hand, he comes out looking like he used his power for good in the overall coalition. And given the numbers we're talking about, there may not be, much of a price to pay and maybe some real rewards for that. particularly given that, Governor Abbott, gave a very, Abbott-like response, I think today or late yesterday, I guess it was this morning, in a question that I think was from Patrick Svitek, about how he felt about this. And he was, non-committal under the umbrella of the priorities that he laid out for the special session, which really was in this area, was a completely underspecified requirement that the legislature move to make the Second Amendment, to make Texas a quote unquote Second Amendment sanctuary state. Now we've riffed on that, and we won't go back to the linguistic construction there. But to me, that is the governor saying, "Well, we'll just see what the legislature is going to do and how they handle it." And given that there's all this other stuff going on, he will sign what they send him. He will claim credit for the things that are not in this bill, but that are, pro-gun rights. And, to the extent that you don't get a unlicensed carry bill, he'll blame it on the lieutenant governor.
Yeah, and maybe call a special session to force it. Maybe not. I mean,
or add it to the redistricting.
Yeah,
or something.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I can't help but wonder how many. I mean, I'm sure some people know this. From whether either explicitly or implicitly. But I wonder in this discussion how many votes short they are.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the question. I mean,
because I would think, if they were one vote short, and I'm thinking of one vote in particular, I'm not sure why they don't just have that vote. If it is the case that the lieutenant governor would actually want to push this policy forward in some way, which, but I think your point is a good one, though, which is just to say, to the extent that Patrick can go and come up with a compromise, he'll be able to go into 2022 saying, hey, not only did I expand gun rights, but I did it in a way that, the police officers that we so support were able to get on board with.
Yeah, I did it against some headwinds, and I think in terms of, not to get too psychological here, but I think.
Oh, please.
Well, I think Lieutenant, it's shallow psychology.
That's the most
my
fun
favorite
kind. Yeah, I was going to say.
Or maybe that's it. Well, never mind. But I think, and I think this plays into why I think that. All this, the constant speculation that Dan Patrick is chomping at the bit to be governor. I think Dan Patrick really is invested in this image of him as, the master of the Texas Senate, and as having, reasserted the power of the lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm. I think, and again, that's not even a remotely negative judgment. If I was Dan Patrick and I could feel like I was, a masterful lieutenant governor, I'd feel pretty good about it too, probably. And I think that plays into this.
I don't think that's critical. And I would say, even in a slightly less critical way, it's always been my read that, Dan Patrick seems much more interested in getting policy wins. That's something that he can do very actively as lieutenant governor. It's a lot harder to do as governor.
Yeah. Yeah. I think his sense of that is very, it's very, to the extent that, that he comes across as very as an ideological warrior, those things are not, he integrates those two priorities of his, I think, fairly consistently and fairly predictably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? And I think that's going to loom very large here. So, to the point about the Senate, I also think I suspect anyway, and this is having talked to other people, it's, I suspect there's one or two senators, one of whom is probably pretty committed based on, I almost used a gender pronoun, that senator's track record.
And public statements.
Based on the same track record, can also be worked with on this. And it's not a principled opposition to the gun rights piece per se. So with that, hopefully by next week's podcast, we'll know.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, because it's quite it's an interesting situation with a lot of interesting currents in public opinion. You can find more about those currents in public opinion. I think we'll probably have a post on this topic pretty soon in our blog zone at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks to Josh for being here again today. Thanks to our excellent technical crew in Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening, and have a good and safe week. And we'll be back again with another Second Reading podcast next week. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.